but it was every day and throughout the South. When you see a face like this, you know who this is. You think of this as terrorism. Osama bin Laden, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the mastermind of 9/11. We know these names. We know these faces. Carlos the Jackal. We know these people are evil, evil people. What about this man? Nice-looking man. I once said to someone who knew him very well and who covered him, I said, you know, he looks like a Sunday school teacher. And my friend said, he was. He was also the head of the Ku Klux Klan in Mississippi. His name's Sam Bowers. He had blood on his hands. He was only convicted in one murder, and that was the tragic killing of a man, Vernon Damer, in Hattiesburg, Mississippi, where the Klan surrounded his house, torched his house, and Damer got his family out and pulled out his gun and was trying to hold the line to fire back at the Klansmen, and ultimately he died of terrible burns. He was a terrorist. Who is this man? This is a man, looks like he could have been a, little pee-wee football coach or something like that. Bob Chambliss. Bob Chambliss really liked to be known by his nickname, Dynamite Bob. And Dynamite Bob lived in Birmingham and was just profoundly white supremacist and racist, full of invective everywhere he went. And everyone knew it, and he was not ashamed of it, okay? He did something very dastardly in September of 1963. He and 3 other men on a Saturday night drove up alongside a church in Birmingham, the 16th Street Baptist Church, and they planted bombs under a stairwell leading into the church that detonated the next morning, and you know the story. It killed 4 little girls. 3 of them were 14 years old, and 1 was 11. Dynamite Bob, that was in 1963. He was finally convicted, finally arrested, finally pursued, arrested and convicted in 1977. He had 14 years, total freedom, and acted as if he could just do this with impunity. The 3 other men, 1 died. The 2 others acted with impunity, evaded the law without having to run. In plain sight, they evaded the law. They just went about their lives in Birmingham until the late 1990s. That is a long time to be free men after such a tragic incident of killing 4 little girls like that and ruining lives and shattering Birmingham. But at the same time, I'm happy to say they triggered such phenomenal interest in civil rights across the nation, and they provoked President Kennedy, and they provoked the United States Congress to ultimately pass what became the 1964 Civil Rights Act. Let me tell you about this fellow right here, James Ford Seal. So some of you know the story of 1964 when 3 civil rights workers, let me back it up. In 1964 was the summer of Freedom Summer. Okay, that's when students your age from all across the country, knowing that this had been going on way too long in the South, the dehumanization of African Americans, the degradation, the violence against them, that people your age, and I mean overwhelmingly white people, white kids, white students, all decided they wanted to go to Mississippi for Freedom Summer, open up freedom schools, open up freedom libraries, help families get services, do a lot of things. There was just so many projects that they had in mind for the whole summer in Mississippi. And they gathered in Ohio first for training. And they were warned, and so the training, if you ever get a chance to look at some of the video of their training, where they would actually beat up on each other and show each other how to protect themselves against getting beat up, how to take insult and not fight back, how to have, mustard poured over you and ketchup and sugar and sorghum and all this stuff while you're sitting at a counter trying to order at a restaurant. This is all, a faux situation anticipating what they would encounter in Mississippi, and how not to fight back, how to take it in a nonviolent way. And they were all trained to do that. And so on the first day of Freedom Summer, they all come into Mississippi, and on the first day, the Klan sends a message. They lure 3 Freedom Riders into Philadelphia, Mississippi by burning a church, a black church. And so Mickey Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney all go there to check out this this African-American church. Goodman and Schwerner are both white guys from the north. Mr. Chaney is an African-American guy from nearby Meridian, Mississippi. They get arrested by the sheriff for whatever and taken to jail. They're held in jail. There's a big alarm. They're missing. And he says, no, they're not. They're right here. And we let them go. And they did let them go. And then after they got out on a road, some Klansmen went and abducted them and buried them. No one knew where they were for 44 days. These guys were missing. The governor of the state of Mississippi said, they're not missing. They're down in Havana with Fidel Castro drinking margaritas and having a good time and laughing at us. But in fact, they were missing. And President Johnson, Lyndon Johnson, sent in 200 to 300 Navy men to dredge every body of water in South Mississippi, okay, looking for these bodies. And they got all the way over to on the other side of the state toward the Mississippi River. And all of a sudden, they're dredging on an offshoot of the Mississippi River, pulls up a body, an African-American man. And they think, oh, we got him. We found them. This must be James Chaney, okay? And then they pull up another body, okay? He's also African-American. So the configuration isn't right. This is not Chaney. And who is this? Well, it turns out to be two young men, 19 years old, Charles Moore and Henry Hezekiah D., who lived down in Meadville, Mississippi, Franklin County. And they were away from college, and they were hitchhiking through town. And these Klansmen come by in a car. He's in the car, and another man named Charles Marcus Edwards. And one of them says, and it was Mr. Edwards, sees that Henry Hezekiah D is wearing sort of a head, what we call a do-rag on his head, okay? And stupidly, ignorantly, okay? Here's why you don't ever want to be ignorant. Here's why you want to get educated on cultures and on other people. He says something like, look at that thing on his head. I think that must mean he's a Muslim. No, I mean a Panther. Well, you know, I don't know, Panther, Black Panther, Muslim, whatever, okay? And he doesn't know what he's talking about, but they take these two guys and they throw them in the car and they drive them out to a refuge, a forested area, and they tie them to trees and they pull out these long reeds from the ground and they strip them of their leaves and they are just whipping them mercilessly. And then they shot them. And they were all but dead. I mean, this goes on for a long time. These guys are all but dead. Various Klansmen have come and gone. And then they throw them in the trunk of James Ford Seal's car. Mr. Edwards, who I mentioned to you, he left the scene. He had to go to work, okay, and that becomes important later. James Ford Seal takes them down to this offshoot of the Mississippi River. They're still alive, okay? And I'm going to tell you right now, I should give you some alerts that these are some gruesome stories, okay? These are some difficult stories, and I get upset telling them, okay? And if anyone feels like that this is going to be too much, I won't be offended if someone needs to be excused. And I might actually use some language that you have heard and that you know exists, but that is the language of the time and the way people refer to people. So I'm going to tell you that in advance. And if you feel like it'll bother you or you might be offended, I have no problem if you want to step out. But these two kids were still alive when these Klansmen strapped one of them to an engine block and one to railroad ties, and they threw them in the water where they drowned. And they probably mercifully drowned, given the condition. And so during the 44 days that they're looking for Schwerner, Goodman, and Chaney, they find these bodies. And there's this moment, you can just imagine that there's this national moment where people say, just catch their breath and say, my God, do you mean you can dredge any body of water down here and you might find this situation? You might find missing and murdered bodies of people? And I don't have the answer to that, but there are many who have never been found. Ultimately, it wasn't until 2005, 2004, 2005, when a Canadian broadcasting journalist and the brother of Charles Moore, Thomas Moore, having retired from the Army, go into Mississippi to try to solve this murder. They've been told by everybody that James Ford Seal is dead. He's been dead a long time. And they find that he's not dead. He's alive. He's living his life. They see him carrying his groceries into his house one day. And Charles Marcus Edwards, the Klansman who was there, was ultimately persuaded to testify against him and to tell the truth. And there's I won't go into all the details, but there was a great moment of forgiveness when Thomas Moore, the brother of Charles Moore, goes to Charles Marcus Edwards while the jury is out, the federal jury, and says, I don't know what the outcome is, but you testified to the truth yesterday, and you told the truth, and you apologized to the families, and I want you to know that I forgive you. And these two men, the Klansman and the brother of the victim, started quoting scripture together. It's just very powerful, okay? And ultimately, he was convicted, went to jail in 2006 for this abduction and murder in 1964, okay? And he died in jail. It was this case that led the Attorney General of the United States, Alberto Gonzales, to say that we're going to have an FBI initiative, a civil rights cold cases initiative, and we're going to investigate all these old accumulated cases that we've never investigated. Great idea. He had no idea how he was going to do it. Somebody said, well, do you got a list? He said, I don't know. And they went to the Southern Poverty Law Center in Montgomery, Alabama, and they said, we have a list of martyrs on our wall. We don't, I don't know, but they provided a list, and it was a messed up list. It was just wrong all around. But it had about 109, 110 names on it throughout the South of cases that had not been resolved, okay? At the same time, journalists were all over these cases, and we're looking into some of them already. In particular, a guy named Jerry Mitchell in Jackson, Mississippi, with the Jackson Clarion Ledger, known as the Simon Wiesenthal of the South, who was the Nazi hunter. And Jerry Mitchell was going after these cases and these Klansmen with a righteousness. And Jerry was great. Jerry was a deeply, profoundly Christian man, and he could talk the language of these Klansmen. He could cite scripture to them as they're talking, and ultimately they were all acknowledging to Jerry, in many cases, what they had done, and they had no shame for what they had done. So that was what life was like at the time. Let me just stay on this theme for a little bit more. If we think of this as terrorism, this is Fallujah, Iraq, when American contractors are burned to a char and hoisted up on a bridge. Certainly we must also acknowledge that this is terrorism, okay? If this is terrorism, a bus being firebombed in Karachi, Pakistan, what is this? This is terrorism in Andersen, Alabama, as the freedom rides were going through, okay? So this is the time frame. This is the time period that we dealt with in the race beat. It was a very, very difficult time, obviously, for a lot of people. I pray you never have to live through a time like that. In the 1930s, mid-1930s, America had come out of the Great War, World War I. We didn't call it World War I then because we hadn't had World War II, okay? It's called the Great War. And we were coming out of the Depression in 1938, and a group of men in New York City, the Carnegie Corporation Foundation, these are all men probably, I may be wrong, but worth checking out. They've certainly been dominated by men, dominated by white men, pinstripes, the whole idea. They said, we have a lot to be proud of in this country, but the one conundrum, the one problem, the one dilemma we've never sort of figured out here is the race problem in America and how to bring people together. We don't understand each other. We don't understand how people are living. and what their lives are like. And so they decided to commission a report. And they hired a Swedish economist named Gunnar Myrdal. He's on the right. And a man of towering intellect, an African-American man named Ralph Bunche. And they put them on this examination of race relations in the South. They gave them 125 researchers and a blank check and said, take as much as it costs and as long as you need and study race relations. And they did. And they got monographs from all these other researchers. And in the end, from 1938 to 1944, they did their work and they produced an American dilemma. It makes the race beat look small. It's 1,483 pages, okay? And while it's not always the easiest reading, it can be some fairly turgid prose, it's fascinating reading, okay? It's just fascinating reading. I won't go into all of that right now except to say that it tried to define American ideals. Now, I will tell you, Gunnar Myrdal had a very positive view of Americans. He said, you know, Americans have what he called the American creed. They believe, if you read all their documents from the founding of the country, and if you see the things they say, they believe in justice, they believe in fair play. And anything that departs from that, they don't believe in, but they are easily misled. And demagogues rise and demagogues fall. Leaders will abuse the American people and take advantage of their ignorance and what they don't know, and lead them into believing things that aren't true, into believing mythologies about people. And he said, as a result, there's incredible, he said, an astonishing ignorance in America about race and about how the other people live, okay? So how, he said, will we ever overcome this astonishing ignorance in America? How can it happen? Here's what he knew what was the situation. And I'm going to flash forward a little bit in time, but just you'll get a picture of what I mean. He said he understood that it was because of that the news coverage had great influence over what people knew at the time. Newspapers were everything. They were the most important form of communication. They knew, he said, but in the South, people aren't getting the story. So I mentioned Birmingham and the dogs and the hoses. I mean, I'm flashing forward to 1963, but I want to show you something here. This is the front page of the Birmingham Post-Herald, the morning newspaper the day after the dogs and the hoses were unleashed in Birmingham, only blocks from the Birmingham Post-Herald's offices, okay? And I'll save you the trouble of going through every single story. Early court hearing on city sought, Senate recesses killing school aid bill, Hilltop celebrates May Day, plane falls into houses. On and on, you can go on and on. You will not find a word on page 1 about this story that was the biggest, most dramatic story in the United States that day. It was front page of all these other newspapers. They consigned news coverage to page 2 about civil rights with very, stenographic report. 43 Negroes were arrested yesterday after demonstrating, yada, yada, yada. Maybe by the 3rd paragraph, police were, compelled to bring out the dogs, the hoses, things like that. So what Myrdal says, you can't rely on the Southern newspapers to bring the truth out, okay? Now, I will tell you that even progressive newspapers had some odd ways of presenting African-American news. I'm talking about the mainstream daily newspapers, okay? Like, this was quite common in the South, where this is from the Macon Telegraph and News, where they would have a page devoted to the news from the black community, the social and personal news of our colored community. And don't be offended by the word colored. I mean, today that would, of course, we do talk of people of color, but at the time that was the standard language. A few years later, it might have said Negro, then black, then African American. But my point is that they marginalized and put black news and thought they were doing a service. Now, do you know how they got a page? They print up a newspaper, and if you're going to deliver some of them to the white community and some to the black community, you can't just have a blank page in the white paper about this. So you know how they got this page? they took what in the white newspaper was the business news page, with the premise that African Americans are not going to be interested in business news, okay? So we'll just take the business news page and put the colored people's news there, the church listings, the who's visiting with whom. And this is a progressive newspaper in Macon. The black newspapers, as Murdahl discovered, was the fighting press. He said, this is where you are finding the coverage of civil rights. This is where you are finding the truth. This is where all the indignities and degradations are being exposed. In the black press, the Pittsburgh Courier was the widest circulating newspaper in America. It was hugely influential. If you've seen the movie 42 and you see that there's a black reporter, that's Wendell Smith of the Pittsburgh Courier. They are responsible for putting Jackie Robinson in front of Branch Rickey. Them and a guy named Sam Lacey with the Baltimore Afro-American. And they were all over civil rights coverage, okay? But as Murdahl said, no one's reading the black newspaper except black people. They have no influence in the power centers, okay, in Washington or other places. And so African Americans had, but the African American press had the front row seat. If you wanted to know what was going on in civil rights, you had to read the black press. Until a pretty important moment. 1957, the desegregation of Central High School in Little Rock. And I'm just going to give you a quick moment here, and I just want you to watch those pictures, these next few pictures as I click through. This is a man named L. Alex Wilson. L. Alex Wilson at this time was 49 years old. He's a reporter for the Tri-State Defender, the black newspaper in Memphis, Tennessee, okay? And which was owned by the Chicago Defender. And the Chicago Defender opened up the Tri-State Defender in Memphis saying, you know, the big story is going to be going on in Memphis over the next few years. Let's build an outpost and publish a newspaper in Memphis, okay? And there was another black newspaper that was owned by that Atlanta family that I said was very conservative. They wanted to be more aggressive. And they put L. Alex Wilson as the editor. He had covered Korea, the Korean conflict. He'd won the equivalent of the Pulitzer Prize in black journalism, which was the Wendell Willkie Award. Why they named it after a white man, I don't know. But that was and he was a man of enormous rectitude, and he was very dour and widely respected. And he shows up to cover the episode, the integration of Central High School, the 9 students going in there in Little Rock in 1957, and he's beset by a mob, okay? And they kept knocking him down. Look at the humiliation of this man. And this man was a power in Memphis, okay? The mayors and the governors of Tennessee went and met with him, okay? And every time they knocked him down, he would get up and he'd pick up his hat and he'd fix the crease in his hat and he'd put it back on his head and start walking again. And I'm not proud to say that, you know, the press, the Associated Press carried a series of these pictures by a phenomenal photographer named Will Counts. He was with the Arkansas Democrat. But the cut line, they didn't know who he was, and they identified him as a preacher. You know, they just took, well, he must be a preacher. Look at him, you know. And then, whoops, what just happened? Just lost the PowerPoint. Don't send, let's see. Hold on. Are we there? Is it there? It seems like it wiped out all my icons too. The last one. Okay. All right, thank you. That's the last one in the series. You'll notice this man holding a brick in his hand. And I want you to know Alex Wilson, this is in 1957. He's 49 years old. Because of his great journalistic work, he gets promoted to become the editor of the Chicago Defender. Okay, I mean, that's the pinnacle of American black journalism. And that was in 57. By 1960, he's got so much palsy and he's so many nervous disorders from this beating that he died at age 51. And he could have been a great journalist on any newspaper in America. So Murdahl had looked at the black press to see whether it could have influence and said it will among its own people, but not nationally. And ultimately he concluded, and this is that it was the northern press that would come in, and if the northern press would come in and expose the conditions in the South to a northern audience, where there was not really a national press at the time, to a northern audience, that northerners would be, in his words, shocked and shaken by what they learned about what's going on in the South. And they would demand action in these centers of power. And he said, here, to get publicity is of the highest strategic importance to the Negro people. On page 48, in italics, he says that. There is no doubt in this writer's opinion that a great majority of white people in America would be prepared to give the Negro a substantially better deal if they knew the facts. And in fact, time and again, it proved itself. I showed you the news coverage of Birmingham, 1963, in the Birmingham paper, didn't make page 1. This is the New York Times on the same day, okay? The northern press came in exposing to the nation the conditions, okay? Now, I just want to talk to you just for a minute about Hazel Brannon Smith, then we're going to get into the cold cases thing. This is a woman who was from Alabama, had gone to the University of Alabama where she'd studied journalism. She moves to North Mississippi where she's editor of a newspaper there in Holmes County, Lexington, Mississippi, a majority African-American county then. Would have been the situation where it could have been as many as 60 or 70% African-American, and maybe, 10 of them were registered to vote. I mean, it's just the numbers are shocking how disparate they are. She didn't view herself as an integrationist. She viewed herself as a segregationist. She just thought she was among many who just felt like segregation will never end. It's here to stay. We just have to learn to get along with each other. And one day she's on the streets of Lexington, and she sees this black man walking down the street carrying some groceries, and he stepped off against the only light in town, and stepped off the curb when the light was wrong, it was green or something. And the police chief sees him and goes at him and just beats him mercilessly in front of her. Just took out after him, just totally without any provocation. And she is shocked, and she goes back and she begins writing editorials, a series of editorials that say we cannot have vigilante justice like that in this town. That this man was a citizen of this town, and if you think he did something wrong, if you think he did something criminal, charge him, bring him to court, but don't go beating him up. And ultimately, what happened was her building was firebombed. She had to move out of her newsroom. And her husband lost his job as an executive at the hospital. And she was moved to write and try to understand that what she's describing. And imagine this in your own community, in your own dormitory, in your own apartment building, if you had to live in this situation. She said, today in much of Mississippi, we live in an atmosphere of fear. It hangs like a dark cloud over us, dominating almost every facet of public and private life. No one speaks freely anymore for fear of being misunderstood. Editors, preachers, teachers, and other professional people are affected by it, as well as business and industry. Almost every man and woman is afraid to try to do anything to promote goodwill and harmony between the races, afraid he or she will be taken as a mixer or worse. So that certainly gives you a sense of the atmosphere in which that we'll be talking now about some of these civil rights cold cases, okay? I just want to introduce you to a man named James Brazier in 1958. He worked 3 jobs. He was a hardworking man. He was a father and a husband. He had 4 children. He worked 3 jobs. His wife worked 2 jobs. One of his jobs was at the Chevrolet dealership, doing what African Americans, whatever they were allowed to do, gassing up cars, maybe washing cars when they came into the shop, okay? There's one thing that James Brazier liked. He made good money with him and his wife, and we know how much, and we know it was well above average for African Americans, okay, which was way below what whites were making. But he just had something that he liked, and maybe some of you have this too. He liked cars. He liked an automobile. And when he had a chance in 1956 to buy himself a new 1956 Chevrolet from the dealer he worked at, he did. And in 1958, and he gave that to his daddy ultimately, in 1958, he bought another one. He bought a Chevrolet Impala, a nice spiffy automobile, okay? And he thereby incurred the wrath of some local white people, okay? In 1957 of November, he was driving and the police stopped him for one in a series of stops. And they took him to jail and they were hitting him and knocking him down. And he said, "Why are you hitting me? Why do you keep hitting me? Why do you keep stopping me? What have I done?" And they were accusing him of being drunk and this, that, and the other. And finally the police officer says, "I'll tell you why. It's because you got a lot of nerve driving a car like that when we can't hardly live." But he continued to drive the car, and one Sunday morning, he's driving through town. He'd been in church all morning. His daddy had been in church all morning. They'd gone from one church to another church. They'd been to 2 churches that day. At the end of the day, he's driving through town, delivering nieces and nephews and kids and all over to the town, and he sees that police have stopped somebody, okay? And as he gets closer, and this is not the real photo, and the Impala was not the real Impala, okay? It's a representation. He sees that the police have stopped his daddy. And they're trying to force his daddy into the police car. And they're accusing his daddy of being drunk. And he's thinking, "My daddy's not drunk. He's been in church all day." And James Brazier, first of all, he crossed the line by driving up in that nice new car. But then he crossed the line in another way. As he got out of his car and he walked up toward the police. And he said, "Don't hit Daddy no more. I'll get him in the car." You don't speak in the imperative in that culture. That was bad etiquette to ever speak in the imperative like that to a police officer. And they said to him, "We're taking your daddy in. You go home. We'll see you later." And sure enough, the police showed up at his house. This is his house, still there today. And this tree was not there, but they dragged him out and they beat him up some on the lawn, and a lot of neighbors saw it. His kids saw it. His own 10-year-old kid runs up to him and, "Daddy, don't let him take you, don't let him take you." And the policeman knocks him away. You got 3 generations there. You got James Brazier trying to help his daddy. You got James Brazier Jr. trying to help his daddy, okay? They take James Brazier to the jail, okay? The jail was here. This is the county courthouse. It's still there in Terrell County, Georgia, way south Georgia. The county seat is in the town of Dawson. And they had hit him up. They had hurt him enough. They were worried that they had hurt him enough that they called in a doctor. And they had a doctor look at him. And the doctor saw blood in his nose, blood in his ear, and he was slurring his speech. Anybody know what that means, probably? What does blood in the ear mean? What might that be a sign of? Slurred speech. What might that be a sign of? Huh? I'm sorry, I'm not hearing it. Aneurysm. A skull fracture. Could be also, but a skull fracture. There's something going, he's hurt. And the policeman says, "What do we do?" And the doctor says, "I think he's just drunk. Send him back to jail and check on him in a couple hours." Well, there were other witnesses, and there were 3 witnesses in the jail that night, inmates who saw all this. In the middle of the night, James Brazier is passed out in his jail cell, and the same 2 police officers come to get him. And they take him out. And they said, "You're going with us." He said, "Please, don't take me." He's still in his Sunday suit with blood on him. "Don't take me." And they said, "Where are you going?" And he said, "Well, let me get my shoes." He was just trying to buy time. This is what the witnesses later said, the inmates. He said, "Let me get my shoes." And one of the police officers said, you know, this is like, these moments are cinematic, okay? I mean, he said, "You won't need no shoes." And they took him out, and whenever they brought him back, hours later, they just threw him into the jail cell onto a mattress. It just became soaked in blood. He was all but dead. The next morning, he gets taken, lifted up and taken into mayor's court for arraignment, where you plead guilty, probably, you know, to interfering with a police officer, resisting arrest, something. The judge, who's the mayor, says, "This man's of no use to us. Get him out of here. I can bring him back another day when we can actually try him." About that time, James Brazier's wife, Hattie Bell Brazier, shows up. And she's going to take charge. And thank God she did. And she picks him up, and she drives him, and takes him into her car with 2 of her daughters there, who we've spoken with, and one of his sisters, who we've spoken with, okay? And she takes him to the hospital. Now, here's where I'm going to use some language, okay? I'm going to use the language that Hattie Bell Brazier said she heard from a doctor who was standing on the steps of the hospital, and she summoned him over. "Help me, help me. I've got to get my husband into the hospital, into the emergency room." The doctor in a white coat happened to be the medical partner of the man who had seen him the night before. And he goes over, and he leans in the car, and he looks at James Brazier just sprawled out there. And he looks in and he says, "Ain't nothing ailing that nigger. Ain't nothing ailing him but drunk." And turns away and walks away. Well, she picks Hattie Bell, gets him up and takes him in the hospital, sees the first doctor, and says, "Help him." So they got him x-rays. And then the doctor had seen the night before comes back and says, "Nothing I can do for him, widow." Calls her a widow. And so she gets her husband, takes him. The daughter said, drove the 60 miles to the Columbus, Georgia Medical Center in 30 minutes. 60 miles in 30 minutes. It was too late. He died. This is his death certificate. I will tell you, the Washington Post hears about this and a reign of terror by the same police officers in Dawson County, and they send in a reporter named Robert E. Lee Baker, an unfortunate name, and I write about him in the Race Beat. Oddly enough, I had wrote about this in the Race Beat long before I knew I was going to be examining these cases through civil rights cold cases, okay? Robert E. Lee Baker later changed his byline because he was covering so many race stories just to Robert E. Baker, okay? And I will tell you, here's where you can be so proud of the journalism profession. You know, all these years later, I have access to all the FBI reports, all the NAACP reports, and our students do, okay? They get this stuff, okay? And the U.S. Civil Rights Commission report, and the files of lawyers who were involved in all of this. And it's amazing that this Robert E. Baker, coming in as a stranger out of town, spending one day in Dawson and then getting the hell out of there and going over to nearby Albany, where people from Dawson are brought to him to interview, okay? So that he didn't get them in trouble by interviewing them in the town. And his story is completely and totally accurate in all aspects. I mean, it's a phenomenal reporting job. This gets national attention. I just want you to see, again, some of knowing they're being interviewed by a Washington Post reporter who unfortunately misspelled the sheriff's last name, put 2 T's in it. Can you read this? I don't want to have to repeat the word, but I'll abridge it. The sheriff said, "Well, Captain, I believe," he's talking to the reporter about why they have to control these poor, these pathetic citizens. "I believe we ought to be strict about who votes. There isn't an N-word in Georgia who wouldn't take over if he could. They want all the power. The N-word has progressed under our system when we sure wouldn't progress under his. Isn't that right? I tell you this, Captain, all this agitation is the work of communists. You know, they refer to, it just goes on and on, okay? Well, this got some national attention, but I want you to see the two different narratives that you heard then, and I bet you would hear today in some situations, between what a national news organization might come in and see and hear and report, and what the locals would see, okay? Here's when the sheriff, who was this guy, when he died, there was an editorial in the local newspaper, the Dawson newspaper, a weekly newspaper, that just extols him as just this wonderful, affectionate man, beloved by all, okay? You know, he died at 92 years old. You know, great job performance. He and his wife, Miss Wilma, we'd see him at all the this and all the clubs and so on. And then at the end, you know, when St. Peter opened the pearly gates for him last week, I feel sure Zeke greeted him with that same big grin, chuckle, and friendly handshake. It's a completely different narrative from what the African-American community saw, okay? And there's no recognition of it. They didn't write a word about James Brazier's death, okay? Not a word. He was just that kind of man, friendly, cheerful, lovable. Well, the family liked this enough that they put this on Zeke Matthews' gravesite. Friendly, cheerful, lovable. The FBI, by the way, did open, let me click through this. The FBI opened up an investigation into the case. The NAACP examined the case, got really involved. There's some very seamy and unseemly aspects of the case about things that were going on inside the jail with the women inmates, the black women inmates, and how they were abused. No criminal action was ever brought, so Hattie Bell Brazier brought her own lawsuit, her own civil lawsuit. Took her till 1963 to get it in front of a judge, okay, and a jury, and a federal court. And in very short order, she happened to have a judge who was one of the two most segregationist judges that President John Kennedy named to the bench. And she ultimately got it to the jury, but she lost her lawsuit. My students have gotten involved in this. They've gotten a lot of records. They found 2,000 pages of trial transcript on this case. They have the FBI report. I just want to show you one moment. The FBI reports are redacted. Do you know what I mean? They're blocked. Certain parts are blocked out. Names of witnesses, names of the 3 inmates who were in the jail. We've had to go through other ways to find out who they were. But there's this moment that's always exciting in class, and you'll appreciate this as journalists in the making, those of you who are. Here is let me go back. Here's a page in which it goes on and on about a witness. And the students keep saying, of the 3 witnesses, there's one who's really key. She saw more than anything. And they know it's a she because it'd be references to her gender, you know. God, if only we knew her name. If only we knew her name. And one student will always say, oh, didn't you notice? And they say, notice what? Oh, the one page in which they failed to redact her name? Well, I'm telling you, laptops pop open, and students are, you know, doing their Ancestry and their doit.com, and they're searching, you know. One student happened to have worked for the Georgia Republican Party and had access to all the voting rolls, and she's, you know, looking up to see if she was a registered voter, you know. And we found her, and we interviewed her. She's a tragic story, you know. How do I tell you this? I mean, she's 19 years old. She's in jail for having murdered her husband, okay? Now, if you murder someone, do you stay in the county jail? Well, where do they put you? What prison? Which one? State penitentiary. You go to the state penitentiary. Well, so why was she in the county jail for months and months and months? Okay? And the students start to uncover this. And they uncover that there was a system in the South. There may have been a system in Nebraska. There may have been a system everywhere on this. I'm not knowledgeable enough yet, but I know in the South, the trustee system. And that is where the sheriff or the warden or the prison superintendent would pick certain prisoners okay, and tap them. Frankly, the Nazis did the same with people in the camps. Anoint them, bring them up to the big house, make them their cooks, make them, and in the prison, they made these their spies, the trustees, their rats, their spies. And they get certain privilege. So in this particular jail, there was a man, Eugene Magwood, who was the trustee, and he had special privilege. When the sheriff went hunting, he went with him and carried the guns, okay? I mean, the sheriff's giving a man in jail for murder a gun to carry with him while he's going hunting, okay? And he got other sorts of privilege, including, if you read the attorney's notes, which we had, the sheriff had the keys to the white women's cells. And Mr. Magwood, who was African American, had the keys to the black women's cells, okay? And if you read, I'm just clicking off that because I don't want her name on there anymore, okay? If you read deep enough into the NAACP files, you see that in her 10th month in jail, that inmate gave birth to a child, okay? And this was not, she had said this was not a wanted situation. This was not a consensual relationship, So there's a real, horrific situation that was going on there. And we had a chance to meet with her and talk with her, because in the end, when she testified at trial, she was too scared to tell the truth, and she didn't. And I asked her why she didn't, and she said, "You couldn't, not with them sitting right there." This is the civil case where they would have been found either responsible or not responsible. There was no criminal charges, so not guilt or innocence. But she said they couldn't. It's also in the lawyer's notes that one of the policemen paid her $2. She's, So some of this is fairly pathetic. I want you to know that in our research, we're not doing the whodunit. This is about the why. And so students have to read a lot of other material, secondary material, so they understand the climate in which this thing occurred. I want to just take 1 minute here and show you one thing, and then I'm going to quickly jump over to the web and show you one other thing. Am I okay? We okay? All right. This is James Brazier's grave site. Now, we would never have found it without his family, okay? And I don't take the whole class down there, by the way. It's 3.5 hours out of Atlanta. I went down there with my co-professor and one student who had taken the class and then was doing an independent study after that, and then doing her senior honors thesis after that. But we go down there, and we would never have known it was him because it's just washed away, okay? But thankfully, the family took us down there. But he's a cipher otherwise. He's lost to history. And so the charge that I give our students is that I say, we can't bring him back alive, but we can give his life meaning. And that's what we do in exploring this. This is quickly A.C. Hall. He's not unlike the kid in Chicago, Laquan McDonald. He was, walking home with a girlfriend one night from a dance or a little club, when police are looking for a black man who has stolen a gun, and the white woman in the backseat of the police car, while they're looking, says, "That's him." 9 o'clock at night. A.C. Hall sees the headlights and says to Eloise, "We have to run." And she says, "I'm not running. Why are we running?" He said, "We just, nothing good's going to come from this. Police coming up here and a woman yelling, 'That's him.' We're going to run." And he ran. And they started firing at him one of them without even leaving the car. Okay? And he was shot dead. The students have not explored this yet. One student did one summer, but we haven't done it in a class yet. We will. I will tell you that I found his grave site down in Macon, Georgia, and 17 years old. And I'm happy to tell you he's buried next to his mama and to his grandparents, okay? I'm going to quickly shift over to one last story, and that's about this man, Isaiah Nixon. Isaiah Nixon lived down in a town called Mount Vernon, outside of Mount Vernon, Georgia, Montgomery County. He was a farmer and a turpentine worker. And I'm going to shift over to the internet now to tell you more about him. This is, let's see now, how do I pick up on this here? Oh, really? Slide it across the page. That sounds so easy. Just slide it, you know? Yeah. Okay. Oh. Oh, you mean slide it? Oh. Oh, okay. All right. But it's no longer here, huh? Oh, that's okay. That's okay. All right. Oh, okay. Oh, yeah. Brilliant. Okay, thank you. Appreciate it. That's good. So this is our website that we've created, okay? That's James Brazier. You'll see a lot of stories about him. It's coldcases.emory.edu. Cold cases, plural, all right? I'm going to take you here to Isaiah Nixon. Isaiah Nixon in 1948 decides he's going to vote. He's going to vote in the governor's election, okay? And on that day, there were many who decided that black people shouldn't vote. Even though the United States Supreme Court had ordered that they had to allow blacks to vote in the Democratic primary that day, the short version of it is that he votes. The NAACP head votes and gets the hell beat out of him. I mean, he's badly brutalized. Isaiah Nixon votes, goes home that day, he's working at home. Late in the afternoon, two guys show up at his house, two white guys he knew, he'd grown up with. And they said, we need to see Isaiah, come out. And so he comes out, you know, and they said, come on down here, you know, and they're carrying guns. And said, did you vote today? And he said, well, I reckon I did. And they said, well, who'd you vote for? He says, well, I reckon I voted for Mr. Thompson. Well, they were big guys in favor of the other guy, Herman Talmadge, who was running. And they said, well, come go with us. We're just going. And the prevailing wisdom on that is they were going to beat him up. They were going to rough him up, make life rough for him, you know, and as a threat, okay? But he said, no, I'm not going with you. They said, no, you're going with us. Let's go with us. He said, and he started to back up. And one of them, I think the family thinks he'd probably been drinking, goes up under the fence with a gun and fires and shoots him 3 times in front of his wife, in front of his kids. He has 6 kids under 10 years old. His wife has just given birth 3 or 4 weeks ago, maybe a month ago, to their youngest child. And among those who's watching this is a woman named is their daughter Dorothy, who's 6 years old. Well, my students are looking at this, and I hand them 235 pages of FBI documents, which, by the way, the FBI insisted it didn't have for an entire summer until I went to the National Archives. And they said, oh, yeah, we have 235 pages. I said, where'd you get those? Is it FBI? I said, the hell you say? Like, yeah, really. So anyway, you have to really persist on trying to get these things. So we find that his daughter is living down in Jacksonville, Florida, okay? And she tells us the whole story, all right? On that day, these men come up, and she's sitting on the steps leading up to their farmhouse, and she sees these men. She sees Jim Johnson pull out a gun and start shooting her father. Mrs. Nixon comes out of the house, standing on the porch yelling, fall, Isaiah, fall. And he won't fall. She just wants him to get out of the line of fire, and he won't. And he just collapses there, and Mrs. Nixon goes, and she's a little woman, you know, and she's just given birth, and she drags him up into the farmhouse. He's groaning all night long, Dorothy says, who was 6 years old. Well, we find Dorothy living in Jacksonville. I told you. We bring her up to Atlanta, and she meets with the students. She tells us that right after they buried her father at a remote cemetery down in Montgomery County, they fled to Jacksonville, Florida, okay? And by the way, they had a lot of help from the Pittsburgh Courier. The Pittsburgh Courier started writing a lot of stories about this poor family that's, you know, suffering all this, you know, this tragic circumstance, and they raised money to help build a house for the Nixon family in Jacksonville, and they do. And by the way, just to run ahead, things worked out okay in some ways for the Nixon family. And by that I mean Mrs. Nixon, out of those 6 kids, 4 of them went and got full 4-year school degrees in college, and 3 of those got advanced degrees. And Dorothy Nixon Williams now, who we're talking to, 73 years old, she had gone off to Florida A&M and got her undergraduate, went to the University of Maryland, got her master's degree in nursing, and had a career as a psychiatric nurse, okay? And so she comes up to meet with the students, and they're mesmerized by her stories. And she's very honest about what she doesn't remember and what she does remember. And afterwards, 3 students come up to me and said, "We're going down there." I said, "Where?" He said, "We're going down to Montgomery County. We're gonna go down there." I said, "Well, why?" I said, "The farm is overgrown. No one's there, you know. And the cemetery where he's buried, they've never found the gravesite. They know he's buried there somewhere, but they don't know where. They've never found a headstone. And their memory, they don't know. It was 67 years ago. But they know he's buried there somewhere." They said, "Well, we don't care. We just want to go." I said, "Well, can I go?" "Can I, please?" You know. I said, "I'll pay for the gas. I'll drive." So sure enough, you know, 7 one morning, I picked them up. I wanted it to be 8. They wanted it to be 7, okay? We picked up. We drove 3 hours. We go to the library in Montgomery County. We go to the courthouse, and they're climbing up all over the filing cabinets, pulling down records, looking for evidence of the trial. The 2 white men were tried, and very quickly after a 3-hour trial, they were acquitted, found not guilty. And then we're met at the courthouse by an African-American man whose father was part of the same narrative. His father had voted that day, and he's going to take us out to the cemetery. And I mean, it's 17 miles away from where we are, plus a 3-mile dirt road. We would never have found it. We arrive at Old Salem Cemetery, okay? And let me just give you a moment here. And I hope we get sound on this. And I'm going to finish up with this. Oops. These are the students in the library. Here's my fellow instructors. Here's what will, you know, send a panic through your heart when you see your student in a county courthouse climbing up on a ladder. Now look at the ladder there. I said, "Lucy, get down right now." You know, everything. Let me pull that ladder out, you know, before you kill yourself, you know. So, yeah, of course, right, absolutely. This is journalism, you know. That's Mr. Harris who's going to take us there. That's the dirt road. We took pictures of everything. That's the cemetery. Now, watch this. As we're walking, Mr. Harris is going to take us to his father's gravesite, just because we don't. What are we doing there, you know? And a couple of students are fanning off to the perimeter, looking at other headstones because it's a cemetery and they're curious. Okay. And I listened about 3 seconds into this. I hope it's. Do we have sound? We don't. We don't. Here we go. Try it again.
Found Brandon said Isaiah Nixon.
Says what?
Isaiah Nixon. It was covered in mud, so now I'm covered in mud.
There's an Isaiah Nixon?
Yeah, that's what I was. So I saw something that said Isaiah, so I uncovered the date. It says September 10th, 1948.
Wow.
There's a big cement block. It's like on the edge of the woods.
Okay, look how what if you just made a discovery?
Well, she had. This student had found Isaiah Nixon's gravesite 67 years after he was buried. His family had been back to that cemetery many times and never found it. It was off to the side. The headstone, and I'll show you something in a minute, the headstone was blank. It never was carved in, okay? Across the top of the headstone, it said Father. But they'd walk by and there's no name there. And they hadn't noticed that there was a slab of cement that came off it. It had been covered over by years and years of grass and dirt, mud, leaves. It was off the perimeter under this gnarly old tree, and limbs had fallen down. But as she's standing there, the leaves had blown off in such a way that she could see an I and an S. And as you will see, crudely drawn by a finger in wet cement in 1948, or a stick, okay? And then underneath she saw S-E, and she knew he died September 10th, 1948. And sure enough, she had found the gravesite. Now, let me try to get back here. Hold on. Here we go. Can't really see. There was a crack in it and a big twig coming out of it. I had water in my car, so they're just kind of trying to use water to clean it off and dig it out. You can see the XON of Nixon. All right, now let me see. Hold on. Just one more, and then I'm sorry, I've gone on a little long here. Well, here's the last one. And so sorry, I never allow my students to use the word literally, okay? So that was approximately, it was the Friday before Thanksgiving, okay? And then on January 22nd, we called Mrs. Williams right away. We FaceTimed it. She's very capable. She FaceTimed. I wasn't. My students were, okay? And she came up from Jacksonville, this time with her son. She had previously come with her daughter, who's like a college women's basketball coach at University of Central Florida, okay? But she came up with her son and her husband, and I came down with the 3 students and 2 other students, okay? And quite a few other people from Emory. You could imagine the media relations people were totally all over this, And so let me just give you, if you don't mind, 3 minutes and 21 seconds more, and then I'm going to let you ask questions.
To find everything that they could about my father. They were sincerely into it. I could see it from the very first time I met them in Emory University. Your faces will always be in my mind. I heard the video that Hank sent. And then I heard, I found it. It's amazing. They came here not to find Daddy's grave, but just to visit the site in which he was buried. And they found it. That just shows you what a group of students they are. And they're rare. To even want to do this. I saw them all on their knees, trying to clear off and somebody saying, well, I found a bottle of water. I'll go get it and clear off and thank you all. And the amount of information that you found, and I know you still have a lot to share with me, is phenomenal. The whole thing to me is surreal. It is. And when you first called me, I still had a lot of anger, and I think I told you all I did. But after talking to your group, some of that was released. And I want to let you know now, the anger is completely released. And thank you all for that. So good. I can just resolve this. It's been settled. And then looking at this, it's just unreal. I can't say anymore. Except all that's coming in my mind is thank you, thank you, thank you.
And thank you for your time and for your attention tonight. I'm happy to answer questions. I mean, I saw on the list we're here till longer, but if y'all want to keep going, or does anybody have questions? I wouldn't want to cut anybody off. I know some of you want to get back to your studies. Anybody here got some questions? Your distinguished alum, Rex Celine, has questions.
Who are the gentlemen in the video with her?
Her son and her husband. And her daughter could not come. She was in the middle of a basketball season. So.
The son had never seen, the grandson had never, had he heard many of the stories about his grandfather? Did he know the whole story? So it's
Yeah.
a family thing, but
Yeah, and she hadn't seen the gravesite since she was 6 years old and went to the cemetery and went to the funeral, but has, that's hard to remember and could never have, had no memory. She had never, when I sent her all the FBI records, I had, are you ready for this? Because she wanted it, and she had never seen any of it. When I found the death certificate, because others had looked, but they'd been looking in Montgomery County. The family got him out of the county to a hospital in Lawrence County, a neighboring hospital. That becomes a common sense thing to think about if you can't find the death certificate. And he died, and so his death certificate was in Lawrence County, so we provided her that. So.
if I could just come in, what's remarkable to me is for students, and I have daughters this age, who have lived in an entirely different time, but to recognize and reflect and see that's a woman, a modern woman, she's 73, but she could be sitting here talking to you with her, she's on her iPhone, she's everything else. And this happened not only to her family, but in her lifetime, in our lives. We're not that old, but oh my gosh.
This history is not that far back.
In Nebraska to think about that, because you haven't encountered it. The last lynching in Omaha, which I posted some stuff on recently, was like in 1919. Awful, thousands, terrible cases. But this is a woman who they can sit down and have a conversation
Right.
with now, who would not seem to be a relic of the distant past. She's alive and as aware as these guys are. But that history is being lost, and you had it uncovered. And that's just remarkable.
Yes.
After digging up some of these cold cases, have you came across any kind of trouble or like animosity other than what you had mentioned about the FBI not wanting to promote evidence?
Not really. This is not a full-time job for anybody, but I think if we pushed a little bit further, we could create some awkwardness. I feel very strongly that on the James Brazier case, that I would like to be in we know the police officers are dead, okay, and in almost all cases the perpetrators are dead, and we know this. On the A.C. Hall case, the FBI has determined that the perpetrators are dead, but we believe that one of the police officers is alive. and I haven't quite figured out how I'm going to handle this yet, okay? And I would like to handle it before he dies, but it's close in some cases. We have multiple cases. You heard about the doctors who were neglectful, the doctors who just sort of sent him back. We have multiple cases of doctors who were in a position to extend the life or save the life of a victim of a beating, of some brutality, and who didn't. And one doctor, seeing a man who had been kicked, beaten, stomped in jail, his duodenum is separated inside. It's all these sorts of things, and he's screaming on the table, and the doctor turns to a police officer in the room and says, "I think he's putting on." Literally, it's in the record. "I think he's putting on." Okay? And the students track down that the doctor's still alive. 81 years old, has moved to Mississippi. This is how close we are in history. And they pop open the laptop and say, "Can we call him today?" I said, "No." We're not just going to call up a doctor and say, "Do you remember the case in which you let a man," no. And I said, "We're only 2 weeks from the end of school. Let's finish our work, and we'll do it after we finish the work, okay?" So Christmas break came, and I called him. And I got his wife on the phone. And I asked to speak to him. She says, "Oh, I'm so sorry. Dr. So-and-so passed away 3 weeks ago." I said, "Really?" She said, "Yes." And she gave me the date, and it happened to be the last day of classes, And I said, "Oh," I explained to her a little bit. We were examining, the medical field and how it responded, in a racial climate, something like that. But it really reminded me of how close in time we are to some of these people. And I don't assume that he would hate us. I don't assume he wouldn't want to talk to us. Charles Marcus Edwards in the James Ford Seal case was more than happy to finally get it off his chest, off his conscience. You had a man who beat John Lewis, the great congressman, my congressman in Atlanta, who got off the Freedom Ride bus in Rock Hill, South Carolina, and a man whacked him over the head back in the 1960s. And this man lived with this all his life, hating himself for it. And his son knew the story and kept saying, "Daddy, you got to come clean on that." And went with his daddy to Washington, D.C., and went to Congressman Lewis's office and said, "Do you remember what happened when you got to Rock Hill, South Carolina?" And Congressman Lewis said, "Not as well as I'd like. Something happened, that sort of hurt my memory on that one a little bit. I got hit on the head." And the guy said, "I'm the one who did it. And I want to apologize." These guys are getting old, and they're worried that they're not going to go there. They're going to go there, Did you? Yes.
For your historical research, have you found that newspapers today tend to, even if, perhaps more subtly, still kind of be racially biased, even if it's not as, prominent as, what are the colored people up to kind of thing?
No, I think people cover what they're comfortable with sometimes too much, and they don't make it as much their mission. That we just have to be uncomfortable sometimes and put ourselves in uncomfortable situations and cover people we're not familiar with and just be curious. There's no greater admonition you can receive from anyone about becoming a journalist than to be curious. Be curious and ask questions. And so no, I don't think so. No, I think you have to watch it. I didn't get to talk about this in a class today, but I remember once I was editing a story from a reporter who had been off to Milwaukee where there had been some racial disturbances, some people upset about something, and every time, and he was a white guy, and every time he quoted someone from the protest group, the African Americans, they complained, they yelled, they bellowed, something like that, And every time he quoted the white officials, the mayor, the police chief, they said. And I pointed it out to him, and he was a good friend of mine, okay? And he had succeeded me as the Chicago bureau, based in Chicago for the Philadelphia Inquirer, and I was, more awkward about editing my own successor and everything, but he was completely professional about it. He said, "Wow." This is before it ran. He said, "Wow." He said, 2 things. 1, good catch. 2, it's true. That is true. They were yelling and they were complaining, but I can see where in contrast, it looks like, and that is where the heat's coming from. The protest is coming from the African Americans. So they are going to be more vigorous in their commentary. And so he said at the same time, I sort of don't really say that, you know, and I don't remember how we resolved it, you know, but you have to be aware of that. So, any other questions? Yes, please.
Do you think that everyone who did these horrible things, if they tried to make amends, did they really atone for what they did in the past?
Oh, I don't think many of them did, no. But I think some of them have wrestled with their consciences. You know, I mean, because they could do these things. They could go plant a church, bomb in a church Saturday night and go to their own church the next Sunday and act like good religious people. Okay? I mean, but it was, even the churches found rationalizations in their sermons to help their people understand that being, you know, a segregationist or a white supremacist was okay. You know, there were biblical rationale for slavery. You know, there's rationale, you can create rationale for everything, and so they did. But I think what's happened over many years is even these guys are saying, wait a second, that can't be true. You know, that what I did is evil. What I did was wrong. There's no Christian rationale for what I did. And some of them wrestle with that. I wish there were a way to reach out to all of them and say, you know, if you can't come up with the rationale at this point, would you come talk to us? Because we'd like to hear what you have to say, you know. Yes, Rex.
Hey, do you think, I was very interested in the same line of thought. You've interviewed a lot of these folks in one form or another, either in your newspaper career or run into them. For the historical context, were the folks who did the beatings, for the white folks, the white supremacists, is it a function of mob psychology? Is it the mindset at the time? Do they truly, were they true believers in what they were doing? How do they explain this? Because it's not something that...
A large part of it was. I mean, you know, a large part of it was that you have the leaders of the state. So only months before those police officers did that to James Brazier, the Attorney General of the state of Georgia went and gave a speech to the Peace Officers Association, to the trade association of the police officers, right? In which he just gave the most vicious condemnation of the NAACP, which even blacks thought was too moderate compared to others, okay? You know, about how the NAACP was evil, how it was communist inspired, how it had all these evil, nefarious designs, okay? And when you're chief law enforcement officer of the state's given that, you're giving cover to a lot of people to do things, okay? Leaders, you know, look, when you know, Jimmy Davis of Louisiana stood up as governor against the federal government, said, we will not bend to the federal government, and then he lost. The federal government succeeded. They imposed their will on Louisiana. Then Orville Faubus in Arkansas says, we will not bend to the federal government. He knew he was going to lose, but he did it anyway, and he did it to get reelected. He was when on the desegregation of Central High in Little Rock, everybody was on board. The governor himself, Orville Faubus, when he campaigned for governor, he said, if I had been on the Supreme Court during Brown versus Board, I absolutely would have been part of the unanimous majority in support of Brown versus Board. And he was on board to desegregate the schools. The mayor was on board, the school board, the state school board. Everybody was on board until about 3 or 4 days, maybe a week before it was all to happen. And I'm sorry to say, the governor of the state that I now live in, the governor of Georgia, Marvin Griffin, and the guy who had been Speaker of the House went over there to meet with Orville Faubus, and they said, my God, man, do you know what you're doing? And he said, well, what do you mean? They said, you are signing your death warrant, your political death warrant. You will become the Benedict Arnold of the South if you allow this to go on. And I mean, he did a 360, and he goes on statewide television and makes up a reason for bringing out the National Guard to stop it from happening, okay? And so he did that, and he lost, okay? And then next is Ross Barnett in Mississippi. I'm not going to let a single black man, James Meredith, an Air Force veteran, come to our school. And he stood up to the federal government, and he lost. And then George Wallace did it, and he lost. And they did it. Why would they do it knowing they're going to lose? Because it martyred them, because it advanced their political careers, and because it won them so much adulation. When Ross Barnett could stand up at a University of Mississippi football game in the midst of this crisis and say, I love Mississippi. I love her people. I love her traditions. And the place just went wild. Just went wild. And they fed on this. And they were demagogues.
It would have been just easier to build a wall.
Any final questions? Y'all have been very patient. They said till 8:30. I've taken it to 8:29. So, I cut you a break. Thank y'all so much. I appreciate it.